I'm Mark Gaylor. I'd like to take the opportunity to talk to you about colour management, specifically for photographers. Now, I will give a link below this movie where you can download the slide deck that I'm using to walk you through this workflow. Now, what we're doing is we're going to be looking at how we can implement a colour managed workflow, and I'm going to give you an idea of what the benefits are by doing this. Now, one of the key benefits is that it doesn't matter what camera we're going to be using or what camera we're choosing, we're going to get consistent colors. It doesn't matter whether it's a Nikon or a Canon or a Sony camera, the colors will be faithful to the original subject matter. We just have to implement this color managed workflow. Now, the benefits also is when we're working through this color managed workflow, we can reliably have trust or faith in that the colors we're seeing on the monitor are accurate and true. This means that if we perceive that the image is a little bit too green on the monitor, or when we add a little bit of magenta to correct that image, we know we're doing that because we're correcting the image, not basically skewing the image because of inaccurate colors being displayed on that monitor. And this is probably one of the most important things we can do in the color managed workflow. It doesn't make a lot of sense to edit images if we don't know whether it's the colors of the image that are out or the colors of the monitor that are out. And obviously the benefits flow through all the way to the end of the chain if we choose to print. That means that when we send our images to a lab for printing, we're not going to be surprised when we get those images back. If we're printing ourselves, we're basically going to save a lot of money on ink by just hitting the print button once. And then again, no surprises, the print that comes out are faithful to the colors that we were seeing on the monitor. So our biggest problem when we have color managed a workflow is simply the ignorance of others, people who have not yet realized the benefits of color management. Now, we can get poor advice when we're seeking online. The forums are full of people saying that maybe the Canon colors are better for wedding photography than a Sony camera, whereas in reality, if we profile the cameras, the colors would be the same. And so this shouldn't be a reason for us to choose a different camera. Basically, color management has been around for a long time. Adobe implemented this color managed workflow for their software way back in 1998, and this is one of the reasons that you often see an Adobe 1998 on a Canon, Nikon, Sony camera. It's 30 years old, and so the technology is all in place to make color not a mystery anymore. So, and it's also helpful to have a little bit of advice so that if we do pass our images down the line, maybe to graphic designers or printing labs, in some instances these people can be uneducated, and this can lead to surprising colors because they broke the color managed workflow by not implementing it at their end. Okay, so a little knowledge allows us to choose more appropriate people to work with and more appropriate printing labs to print our work. So some people refer to this as color science, and actually the true term for this is color management. And the only way of actually getting a truly color managed workflow is to invest a little bit of time and a little bit of money into color managing and our own workflows that we're working with. What we're looking at here are a couple of the tools of the trade that I use for color managing my own workflow. This is an X-Rite Color Passport that's standing up there. That's the color swatch, and this can help me measure the color characteristics of my camera, and this allows me to get faithful colors when I'm shooting with my own cameras. The other device standing in front of that is an X-Rite i1 Display Pro, and this allows me to calibrate and profile my monitor, and this allows me to have absolute confidence in the colors that I'm editing. So let's just take a look at this. Before we dive deeper, I'll just show you the the workflow for creating a profile for your camera. It's a reasonably inexpensive device, given that you can profile pretty much every camera that you own using this device, and you can just pop it away until you purchase a new camera. Now, the profiles that I create are what's called dual Illuminant profile. I basically take a picture of that color passport, that color reference card, in two different sorts of ambient light. I typically choose sunlight and skylight or shade, and then the software creates a profile in just a couple of minutes, and then the software puts that profile in a place where I can pick it up with the software I'm using. And now I will typically use Lightroom. I'll pick that profile up, and then I'll make that my new default, so that all color images coming in from that camera will show accurate colors. It's not a question of is this camera create more pleasing skin tones than that camera. Basically, all of the colors from my cameras are faithful or true to the actual subject matter. So this is called a dual Illuminant profile. You can actually create specific profiles for individual working situations, such as a studio, but I prefer the dual Illuminant because it's create one profile that's 99% accurate for everything that I am then shooting. Okay, one of the things that a lot of photographers I notice will do is they'll prioritize the camera over every other device that they own. And for me, it doesn't make a lot of sense to invest in a very expensive high quality camera. I'm using the A7R III and the A9 cameras at the moment. These are high quality pro cameras, but it wouldn't then make sense to edit the images from those cameras on a low quality laptop monitor. And so if you are using a laptop, I'm not encouraging you to invest in a desktop computer, but I would encourage you to connect that laptop up to a higher quality monitor than the one that is currently on your laptop. The one that I'm using is a 4K 10-bit monitor, and this is a BenQ SW271 monitor. The ability to edit in 4K just allows me to see the real high quality of the images being produced by my high quality camera. So this makes absolute sense. And the other advantage of using these higher quality monitors is their management of color is much more sophisticated than maybe, say, just an Apple computer. We'll go into this in a little bit more detail further through the tutorial. The colors produced by my BenQ are pretty accurate straight out of the box, which is not the case for most Apple computers. But if you want it to be 100% accurate, then you can go that next step and basically profile or create a profile for the monitor that you are using. And we'll go into a little bit more detail about some of my recommendations later. It does take just 10 or 15 minutes, and I would periodically do this maybe every couple of months just to make sure that the monitor isn't moving, the colors aren't shifting over time. So what happens when we don't color manage our workflow? Now, the illustration in this image shows you a series of monitors which are receiving the same signal but displaying colors in a slightly unique way, i.e. they're all different, and that is because this workflow isn't color managed. Individual settings for brightness, contrast, saturation on each of these monitors only makes the problem even worse. When we actually color manage and basically remove the problem, and this is the solution, basically applying a color managed workflow, is we do this in basically a series of steps. The first part of the process is what's called calibration. We set a standard brightness setting, contrast setting and saturation setting for these monitors. And then we set up and measure the unique characteristics of these devices. Even if they're made by the same company, there's a chances that they treat color quite differently. And so we can measure the unique characteristics of each of these devices so that the software, which is the third step, the ICC color management software, can read the profiles, can understand the unique characteristics of each of these monitors and correct their inaccuracies on the fly. So the signal they're receiving is basically corrected so that colors are accurate. And this allows us to use different makes of monitor, maybe a Samsung or a Sony or a Toshiba, and yet the colors are nearly identical when they're color managed. Okay, and as I said, Adobe made all of this possible 30 years ago. It's surprising to me that many people will give poor advice online and avoiding the actual only solution to this problem, which is to color manage your workflow. So as we dive deeper into color management, it pays to understand a little bit of the terminology that is used in this color science or color management. One of the terms that we often refer to is the color gamut. This is the breadth or amount of different colors that can be captured by the capture device or displayed by the display device, and that could be a monitor or printed out via paper and ink set. Another term that is often referred to is the color model. We can use different ways of basically producing that color. Monitors typically use an RGB color model, where printers typically use a CMYK using the secondary colors cyan, magenta, yellow, and also black, which is the K. Let's take a look at the color space. Okay, the color and tone of a digital image can essentially be described using a series of color numbers. These numbers are, however, meaningless without a corresponding color space or a reference to a specific color gamut. Now let's take a look at that in a little bit more detail. These numbers that describe the color act as coordinates for a specific location on a known color gamut or color space. The same color numbers will produce different colors on different color devices if they are not color managed, i.e. we sometimes have to change the color numbers of an image so that the colors appear the same when handled by a device with a different color space. Because individual devices that capture and produce color all behave slightly differently, they each have a unique color space, Adobe came up with the idea of using a working space that is independent of a particular device, a common reference space that can be used across different devices. Here's an example of two different color spaces, two of the most common ones we encounter as photographers, and these are Adobe RGB and sRGB. Here I've moved my color picker over to these images and selected the same color area, and you can see the numbers on each of the different color spaces, Adobe RGB and sRGB, are actually different. Okay, but they're actually producing the same color. This is why when we're working with color space, the numbers are only meaningful when we connect them to a color space. Sometimes when we're working in a program such as Adobe Photoshop, we need to assign or convert to a profile. Now, assigning preserves the color numbers, and this will lead to a change in the appearance as it adopts a new color space. Now this is typically done when we try and open an image that has a missing profile. It does not have a profile attached to the image, and so we can basically play with different color spaces, and when we find one where the colors seem to be appropriate, we then assign that space to that image. If we're converting, this actually preserves the appearance of the colors by changing the color numbers as the color space changes. And this is sometimes required if we have to maybe convert an image from Adobe RGB to sRGB. We don't assign a space, we convert to the space, and this preserves the color appearance of these images. As I said, the most common occurrence is when we do convert to Adobe RGB to sRGB, perhaps because we're uploading images to the web, or we've taken an image maybe that's been given to us and it's untagged, it has a missing space. Most often we can assume the space is sRGB, but it's always worth just looking at the image and how it differs when we assign either the Adobe RGB or the sRGB color profiles. So let's take a look at working spaces. These are device independent, and we looked at why these are valuable when we're working on colors on a computer, and we're not actually wanting to assign a device space yet, because this image is going to be passed further down the line to other people using different devices. Now, these working spaces are used to constrain the range of colors to a standard working gamut. So we don't tend to basically use a working space that is smaller than we may need. For instance, we typically don't assign sRGB if we're wanting to commercially print these images, because the spaces of CMYK printing is often exceeds or is bigger than the sRGB space, which is often referred to as a monitor space. Now, you will find some labs actually using sRGB, but we're not going to get the best color saturation out of our images if we're sending our images off to a lab that is using the lowest or one of the smallest color spaces, such as sRGB. Now, there are other spaces other than sRGB and Adobe RGB. We also have a space called Pro Photo, which is larger than those two spaces. Now, there is also another space often referred to as LAB or lab that is used to express color in absolute terms. There is no actual device that can actually display the colors of LAB, but LAB is a good reference space when we're converting between two different spaces. We then have the device dependent spaces. Now, these are used to describe the color of a particular capture device, a monitor or printer. These spaces can be described with profiles, and when we're, as a working photographer, we'll often request the device space of a particular printer that we're going to prepare our images for, so we know what we're working with when we're preparing our images. Choosing an basically an RGB working space. Now, if you're only working for the web, then it's appropriate perhaps to choose an sRGB as your working space. But if you're going to be working with web and also commercial print and also inkjet printers, it's worth just expanding that printing or working space out to Adobe RGB. Adobe RGB is perhaps the most common working space for commercial photographers. We actually have a space that's bigger than Adobe RGB, which is a space called Pro Photo. Now, this has led a lot of photographers to choosing this simply because it's got the word Pro in it, I think. But it's a very large space, and most commercial printers can't go anywhere near the Pro Photo space. So as we're preparing to print, I think Pro Photo is a little bit of overkill unless we're absolutely confident our printer's color gamut exceeds Adobe RGB. We'll often hear about the Pro Photo color space used as the Melissa working space. Melissa RGB is the working space of Lightroom, and it uses the Pro Photo color gamut. Okay, so I need to give you a little bit of word of warning about Pro Photo, because I do see some amateur photographers working in Pro Photo, and this can lead to some problems when working in our programs such as Photoshop. So I basically titled this slide, Why Bigger Isn't Always Better. Now, Pro Photo, if you do choose to work with Pro Photo in Photoshop, you have to be in 16 bits per channel, and you have to be very careful when exporting an image that has been working in the Pro Photo color space. Now, when we're exporting JPEGs, for instance, JPEGs will only support 8 bits per channel, and so it's very important that the structure of your workflow is correct if you're choosing to work in Pro Photo. The illustration here shows you the problem of maybe getting that workflow incorrect is if we downsize to 8-bit, there is a serious risk of stepping or banding the color transition, because ProPhoto has been designed to work in a bit rich environment such as 16 bits per channel. Here's another example of a problem with ProPhoto. If ProPhoto is or an image that you've been working with in Photoshop using the ProPhoto space, if you export that image using the default settings of Photoshop, it will often lead to an untagged image. Basically, the profile isn't embedded in the image that you're exporting and then will upload to the web. And what happens is untagged images, most web browsers assume an untagged image, an image not carrying a profile, is an sRGB. So the colors will appear very desaturated when displayed in a web browser. And so two ways around this is to ensure that your images are exported from Photoshop with a profile embedded, or simply to use a smaller working space such as Adobe RGB. Most web browsers will read an Adobe RGB profile, but the profile still needs to be embedded in the image if you're uploading images from Photoshop. Lightroom tends to look after you when Photoshop doesn't with color management. Photoshop will assume that you will understand basically a little bit more about color management than Lightroom, where Lightroom will often protect you by making sure images are exported in the sRGB working space and also downsized to 18 bits in the right order. So most output devices cannot display the color gamut contained by a raw image file, and this can lead to some issues when working with raw images. To give you some examples of this, I'm moving into the develop module of Lightroom, and I'm going to tick on the soft proofing option in the toolbar just below the image. What I'm going to do now is click on the little monitor icon above the histogram. These are no longer the typical sort of clipping warnings that we would see before moving into soft proofing mode. Those triangles that we see before we're working in soft proofing are looking at luminance clipping, whereas now that we've soft proofing, we're more interested in saturation clipping. If I'm clicking on that monitor icon, you can see that on an iMac, if I'm not using my BenQ screen, even the gamut of a late model iMac is quite capable of showing these bright colors that may exceed the color gamut of a lower quality monitor. And to show you that this is the same image, but this time using the profile of my laptop, which uses a lower quality monitor. And you can see that a lot of the colors that were previously in gamut of my desktop monitor are now out of gamut, i.e. they cannot be showed correctly. And this can lead to some stepping or banding of tone or color on a lower quality monitor that doesn't have a large gamut. To show you another example of what happens when we're trying to look at colors that are out of gamut is, and that can be out of gamut of the working space or out of gamut of the monitor that we're working with, is we can lose detail in where colors are appearing very saturated. And to display that, I'm just showing you a picture of the plumage of a parrot, and you can see the example on the left. The out of gamut color is basically stealing away the detail of that feather, whereas if I lower the saturation of the image, that detail returns. Now on a monitor that has a much bigger gamut, or using a printer that has a bigger gamut, we'll be able to get the best of both worlds. We'll be able to get a rich saturated color and also rich detail. So here what we're doing now in the soft proofing mode is, instead of clicking on the monitor icon, we're now clicking on the output icon or the printer icon in the top right just above the histogram there. And here I'm choosing to soft proof to a particular profile, which is an ink and paper combination. And you can see that some of the colors fall outside of the capability of the ink set in order to reproduce these colors accurately. And so this will lead to some detail being lost or when printed. Now, just by changing the profile by using maybe a different paper ink combination, we can actually get those colors to print both saturated and with detail. So this soft proofing workflow inside of Lightroom helps us to choose an appropriate paper to output on, and also maybe even manage the colors if those colors still fall outside of the gamut. We may want to just reduce the saturation of one particular color slightly using the HSL sliders rather than lose texture or detail in that area. Okay, so let's take a look at implementing a color managed workflow in a little bit more detail. And we did look at this earlier, and that is simply to profile your camera. Now, most photographers don't make this step, I have to say. Even a lot of photographers who will profile a monitor don't think to profile their camera as well. And a truly color managed workflow will only work if you profile all devices, that is, capture devices, whether it's a scanner or a camera, the monitor that you're working on, and also the output devices being printers. Okay, so as I said, you can be very fussy and create a profile each time you capture. When I was giving an in-service to the National Gallery of Australia, it was appropriate for the photographers working there to create a profile for every artifact or art piece that they were photographing for their archives to be 100% accurate. Whereas I'm happy just to create a profile for my camera that is appropriate for working in sunlight and shade, and gives me faithful colors in a broad range of working environments, much more accurate than the Canon profile that Lightroom was using before I chose to profile my camera. Okay, so there is a profile being used for a particular studio set. Now in Lightroom, the profiles have changed their location just quite recently. You'll now find them in the basically the develop module. You'll see them right at the top, just below the histogram here, the profile browser. Just click on the icon with 4 little squares, and this will open up and allow you to look at any profiles that have been created by your color managed hardware and software. In this case, the Color Passport I've been using. It is possible to create a new default in Lightroom just by holding down the Option key. You should see the button on the bottom right hand of the screen then change to Set New Default or Set Default. This will allow you to override the profile that Lightroom is using, Adobe Color, and now use the profile of the camera. I have a separate movie on doing that, but the important thing is you don't adjust any other settings when you're just trying to set a new profile for the starting point of your images. The workflow is not too complicated when you're using this X-Rite Color Passport. You can basically just import the 2 images. Here we have 2 images, one shot in sunlight, the other shot in tungsten in this case, and then just go down to File, Export with Preset. The software, when you've installed it, will allow you to pick up Color Checker Passport. You name the profile, and then you'll have to restart Lightroom after the profile has been created before you can find that profile inside of Lightroom. And you can also use this profile in Adobe Camera Raw with Photoshop as well. So choosing a monitor, as I said, most general computer monitors are compromised when it comes to displaying work accurately. Now the Apple monitors have got better more recently. We now have 10-bit monitors with larger color gamuts, but these still don't approach the accuracy of monitors such as the one I'm using from BenQ or ASO. Make a range of high quality monitors for professional photographers and printers, and I would encourage you to start researching one of these monitors if color accuracy and quality is important to you as a photographer. On your shopping list of specs, if you don't choose ASO or BenQ, would be things like 4K resolution. 2.5K resolution will give you a cheaper monitor, but if I'm using a 42 megapixel camera, it makes sense to see as many pixels as possible, so I can see absolutely sharp images on the monitor that I'm working with. I would also prioritize a larger color gamut, one that can approach or basically display the full Adobe RGB color gamut rather than the much smaller sRGB color gamut. So therefore your monitor is suitable for preparing images for web but also for print. 10-bit color display is very important if we're going to calibrate and adjust the white point of our monitors and the brightness of our monitors. It's very important that we're working with not an 8-bit monitor but a 10-bit monitor. If we're working with an 8-bit monitor and we choose to calibrate, adjust the white point and also the brightness of the monitor, this can also lead to stepping and banding of tone and or color. If you're looking for the best quality profiles, you're looking for hardware calibration. So once you've got those four pieces of specs checked off on your shopping list, you should really have an excellent quality monitor for your high-end work. If you're then going into your software, if you're a Photoshop user, you will go into the color settings. You'll choose your working space. Now, some people will choose Pro Photo, but if you're preparing images for just a regular commercial printing or inkjet printing at home, Adobe RGB would be a more appropriate space 95% of the time, to be perfectly honest. If you're converting images for commercial offset litho printing, you will need to change the CMYK working space periodically. US web coated swap version 2 is the most popular, but it's very important that if you're converting images for press, that you do ask the press what CMYK profile they're using. Otherwise your colors are going to shift radically if you choose the wrong CMYK space to convert your images to. Some people think it's just a matter of going image mode CMYK, but it will use the default working space that you've set here in this dialog, and if you choose the inappropriate CMYK space, as I said, your colors could shift radically from what you expect to see. And then a client is not going to be very happy that neutral colors suddenly appear in green, for instance. Okay, so you'll also choose color management policies at this stage, whether to preserve the embedded profiles of images that you're opening or convert to the working space. Now you may want to research a little bit more before you choose those appropriate settings in your own workflow. There are also preferences in Lightroom, but it's important to note that you can't actually change the working space of Lightroom like you can do with Photoshop. You can basically in the external editing preferences choose how images leave Lightroom. For instance, if images are leaving Lightroom for me and I will manage them then from Photoshop and they're not returning to Lightroom, I will typically choose a a smaller color working space than Pro Photo, which is the default. I will typically choose Adobe RGB. If, however, you're only opening images from Lightroom into Photoshop, you're saving and those images are returning to Lightroom, it is possible to leave those default settings as Pro Photo. The default settings in Lightroom will always ensure the images are going out at the 16 bits per channel. Pro Photo will be the default, and when they come back in at Pro Photo, Lightroom will look after you if you're then exporting images for the web or for print. Okay, so profiling your monitor, there are a range of calibration devices. My personal opinion is the X-Rite i1 Display Pro is the premium monitor calibration or profiling device. A lot of people refer to them as calibration devices, but actually the most important function that these devices do are actually to profile your device. The calibration is usually done manually just by adjusting the brightness and contrast settings of the display you're working with. These devices, however, will work with software to measure the color inaccuracies of the colors being displayed, and this will help Photoshop and Lightroom correct colors on the fly so that you're always seeing true colors when displayed. Preparing the working environment is an important aspect when we're editing images. There's basically an illustration here saying what's wrong with this picture, and that is this is the most inappropriate place you could choose to position your monitor. The glare and reflections off the window opposite the monitor would cause a problem for the colors being displayed. You really need to move that monitor around so it's facing a wall, so that we don't have any stray light hitting that monitor. The monitor should typically be the brightest light source in the room, so I'd work with a slightly dimmed room environment. And I'd also, if you're working with a monitor with a very shiny screen, I'd also avoid wearing very saturated colors when sitting in front of the monitor, because this will basically skew the colors that you're actually viewing on the monitor screen and lead you to editing inappropriately. For instance, if you're wearing a lime green t-shirt, the colors that you're going to be viewing will take on that color or a certain percentage of that color hue, and this will lead you to start color correcting inappropriately. The calibration part of the process, as I said, will be to choose a white point and also a gamma and a luminance. Now, for working with low quality 8-bit monitors, and you might have to do some research to see what the bit depth of your monitor is, but typically if you haven't paid a lot of money for that monitor, then it's most likely to be an 8-bit monitor. I would actually skip over this in the calibration profiling workflow with your device and basically choose native white balance, native luminance, because of the risks of invoking tonal stepping or banding if you're trying to adjust the white point and brightness of a monitor, putting it out of its comfort zone where it was really designed or made to be operating. If you're working with the higher bit depth monitors, these allow themselves to be adjusted for white balance and brightness without any risk of stepping of tone and or color. The characterization of the monitor, that's the profiling, is the most important step in this process. Now, this is a way of measuring and describing how the colors are displayed. So you might find on one monitor blues are presented slightly cyan or turquoise, and the characterization process will measure those inaccuracies. So when those blues are being displayed, they'll be corrected on the fly so they're always displayed correctly. So basically removing any unique characteristics of your monitor, so you're only getting faithful or accurate colors displayed. There is a lot more information online about this process. One of the labs that I'm using, which is a wealth of information, is a company called Image Science, and they've got a very information-rich website, which is imagescience.com.au, and you can get a lot of information about the process of color managing and calibrating and profiling monitors on that website. And this is referred to as an IT8 target. You can often download these files from these print service provider, and then you really need to follow a workflow so that you can print this target file without color management. Now this is a little bit harder than you might imagine because for instance on Apple workflows, the color sync app really decides always to try and step in and always color manage. So there is workarounds for this, and Adobe have created a little app which is an Adobe printer utility which basically allows you to print IT8 targets with no color management. So basically your printer is allowed to print with all of its inaccuracies or characteristics, and that can then be measured by your print service provider. There is a lot of information online about this part of the process, and I've put some links there. If these links are too long to type into your browser, just remember I will make the slide deck available as a PDF where those links will be active links. So this is an illustration of what the lab would do with your IT8 target when you've returned it to them. They will start then measuring that, and they'll create a profile for your printer. Now this profile will just be suitable for one paper surface. You need a different profile for each different ink paper combination, and so it's best just to choose your favorite 2 or 3 paper surfaces rather than creating a profile for every single paper that manufactured on the planet. Typically the profile can be even emailed back to you. It doesn't have to be sent on a drive, and it can be a little bit more complicated on a Mac to install this profile. You need to locate your color sync folder where those user profiles will live. It's a little bit easier on a PC because the fact is you just right click on the profile that is sent back to you and choose install profile, and then you'll be able to pick that up in programs such as Lightroom and also Photoshop to then exercise that final step in the color managed workflow. In Lightroom, the profiles won't be added automatically. In the print module, you'll have to choose the other in the profiles, and basically then select which profiles you want to add to Lightroom. Typically this means that you'll just be adding the printer profiles that you want to work with, and then you can soft proof to these specific printer profiles as well. You can also find some high-end printing labs will make their own profiles available to you so that you can download and you can soft proof to profiles from printers that you don't own, and this will help you prepare colors appropriately. And that is done through, as I said, through the soft proofing feature inside of Lightroom. Now remember, Lightroom uses the color space Melissa RGB, and that is a very large Pro Photo color gamut. Now the only problem with that Pro Photo color gamut is if you're not soft proofing, the clipping warnings that will show you oversaturated colors are very slow to show you that there's any problems. And so if you don't want to be surprised when printing, you really do need to activate that soft proofing option in that toolbar in the develop module, and this will allow you then to see what colors may be a problem. You'll see what colors are a problem for your monitor, but then you can also see what colors are a problem for your chosen paper that you're choosing to print with. So once you've implemented that color managed workflow, you really need to test that print workflow to see whether you're getting accurate colors from the subject that you've photographed right through to print. Okay, and just remember that your printer profile, if you are going to print, is only suitable for one printer and ink paper combination. Okay, so just remember also that if you are going out to print, if you do locate colors that are a problem for your chosen printer, paper, ink combination, rather than choosing a different paper, if that's not an option, you can manage those colors. You can do that simply by going into the HSL tab. The software will show you, or Lightroom will show you, what colors are problematic, and as you lower the saturation of that one color, you'll see that the clipping warnings basically cease, and it will show you when you're getting maximum detail in there. Often it is a little bit of a compromise. We want a little bit of saturation, and we're trying to get as much detail into those areas as possible. When working on a project that may be output to print and web, it is usual to choose a working space larger than sRGB. Now that's okay in Lightroom, but if we are choosing Adobe Photoshop, we do want to choose that larger working space, perhaps Adobe RGB. It's important, however, when we export our image for the requirements of an output device, that we convert the working space to an appropriate output or device space. So if we have been working on an image within Adobe RGB for print, we would then need to convert that to sRGB, as most casual users using cheaper monitors will typically be working with that much more restrictive sRGB color gamut. If you are saving for web from Photoshop, just remember the default options don't really look after you in Photoshop, because the embed color profile is usually unchecked by default. So if you are going into Photoshop and you're exporting for web, just remember to check that embed color profile and convert to sRGB options if you have been working in Adobe RGB or even the even larger ProPhoto color gamut. Now this isn't common for most photographers, the need or requirement to convert to grayscale. If we're working with inkjet printers, then we basically leave the images in RGB. We don't convert to grayscale, even though we want a black and white image from our inkjet printer. Basically, inkjet printers are expecting RGB images, not grayscale. And some of the high-end inkjet printers will actually include a light black ink and light magenta and light cyan inks in order to render light grey tones on a black and white image. Okay, but if we are going out to commercial offset litho printing, there is a requirement to convert to grayscale. Now in that conversion, we need to be aware of the dot gain. So again, we often need to contact the printers to work out what an appropriate dot gain setting is. Now dot gain is all about how much those dots of black ink will spread when they hit the paper, and lower quality papers, the ink dots will tend to spread a little bit more, so the dot gain values will be a little bit higher. It's important to get the right dot gain. If we don't get the right dot gain, there is a risk that those black ink dots will spread a little bit too far. They'll join with the other ink dots and they'll basically steal away any detail in those shadow areas. So often when printing, you are going to come across a lot more interesting and complex terminology. Like we often have a choice of rendering intent, which is the two mostly used by photographers are perceptual and relative colorimetric. Now my particular favorite rendering intent is perceptual. I feel it just handles the colors that are still slightly out of gamut that I wasn't able to manage in Lightroom perhaps. It does handle those and brings them back into gamut as best it can. It's never really perfect, but it does the best it can. But I've also noticed in perceptual the amount of shadow detail that it preserves is a little bit more than relative colorimetric. So that is the reason for my preferred rendering intent when choosing printing inside of Photoshop. If you are viewing prints that you've had printed, just remember that viewing them at night using your tungsten globes is probably not an ideal environment to view those prints. There are gaps in the color spectrum of typical tungsten lights. If you are going to view prints, then I would either recommend just using daylight by a window or investing in some specific light sources that don't have these gaps in the color range that they're using. And one of the most used globes for people who are a little bit fussy about that is a globe called Solux. These have a known white balance, and they have a big range of colors, so there are no gaps that could possibly make some colors that you're viewing artificially darker than they need to be because of those gaps in the color spectrum. A word of warning about CMYK. A lot of commercial photographers, when they're moving in to professional work, the client will ask them to do the CMYK conversions. Now, a word of warning here, really, you can't assume that the printer is using the most common CMYK color space, which is US Web Coated Swap version 2. You just can't assume that. So you have to ask the client what CMYK profile is the appropriate one to use. And unfortunately, we touched on this very at the beginning, is the ignorance of others sometimes weighs in. Now, you can find that the client doesn't know and will put you in touch with the printer, and alarmingly, the printer doesn't know either. Okay, and so color can be a little bit of a mystery once produced by the printer. Now, when colors are skewed quite dramatically, often the client is not happy and they're wanting to find someone to blame. Now, the person to blame usually is the person who did the CMYK conversions, and so CMYK conversions shouldn't be taken lightly. So typically, if I am doing this type of work, is I want a little bit of a premium on my price that I'm charging the client to manage this part of the workflow, because it does involve talking to the printer, maybe getting their profile, maybe loading it into Photoshop before doing those CMYK conversions. Now remember, CMYK conversions are not possible in a program such as Lightroom. You are going to need a program such as Photoshop or InDesign in order to make those CMYK conversions. It's a little bit of work and there's a lot of responsibility. And so if you are going to take on that work, just remember you are going to have to skill up, and I would definitely recommend charging a premium on your job if the client is insisting on CMYK files for print. It's basically a question of whose responsibility is it, and this really must need to come into terms of the contract, and I would strongly recommend that's a written contract. Okay, so if I am taking on that responsibility for color accuracy right through to maybe pamphlets or brochures or magazines being printed, then I am going to not only manage that color workflow, but I'm also going to request for printer's proofs from the printer. These will be usually 2 signed copies. The printer will keep one, I will keep one. If the final print job deviates too much from those printer's proofs and I have my signed copy, then the printer is at fault and they are obliged to reprint the commercial job. I've had one job that was printed inaccurately, blamed on the forklift truck driver who picked up the wrong ream of paper to put on the printing press. This is a workflow that can work seamlessly if everybody does the right thing, but it only takes one person to do the wrong thing and the whole thing comes crashing down. So if you are doing this through InDesign, if you didn't know a little bit about desktop publishing, it is actually okay to load RGB images into a program such as InDesign. And when that is creating a PDF for the printer to print the commercial job, those images are converted to CMYK by the InDesign workflow. Again, I would typically want the profiles from the printer and load them into InDesign so that I'm not typing those profiles in manually. I'm basically referring to job options that have been supplied to me by the printer. If the client is exceptionally fussy about color in a CMYK printing press job, then you may want to look at some colors you strongly suspect are not going to look as vibrant in CMYK as they do in RGB. Just remember, a very vibrant blue is going to be very difficult to produce in a CMYK workflow, which is using a cyan ink, not a blue ink in their workflow. They can only approach the colors that you were seeing that were very saturated on an RGB device. This can lead you to managing those colors in the soft proofing mode of Lightroom or Photoshop, or it can encourage you to maybe go back to your client and saying that the colors are not going to be super vibrant if they're choosing very strong blues for their job. And you can actually add what's called spot colors. You can add more than the CMYK, the 4-color printing process. You could possibly add a very vibrant blue ink to that the print job if the client is insisting on a very vibrant blue as their end product. So again, this is done from a position of skill and knowledge about color management if you're taking on these responsibilities. Once you've got a color managed workflow in place, it might sound like a very complex workflow, but it actually works seamlessly. Once you've profiled your camera, your monitor, your printer, there isn't actually a lot to do. It doesn't lead to a lot of extra work. In fact, it leads to no extra work. The only time it leads to extra work for me is if I'm converting to CMYK for a client, but then I'm charging for that part of the process, and so that is something that I'm prepared to take on. Okay, but if you're just staying with an RGB workflow, once you've got those profiles all talking to each other, it's a no-brainer. And when then you see on forums people are talking about that Canon's colors are better than Nikon's colors, you can just shake your head and going, color management is 30 years old. We don't need to be having those conversations anymore. The tools and the workflows have been in place for an incredibly long time, and those arguments cease to be a discussion point if people color manage their workflows. Hopefully I didn't bamboozle you with too much information around that those printing workflows at the end. As I said, I have made this PDF available. Just click on the link if you need to revisit some of those issues in a little bit more detail, or click on some of those associated links that you can go to skill up in some of the areas we've been talking about today. Okay, so I'm Mark Gaylor, and I hopefully you found some new skills by listening to this tutorial. Okay, cheers.